In today's episode, Lou and I are going to be going through 10 different rappers, and we're going to be asking the question, how many classic albums do they have in their discography? Maybe they have 15, for all we know. Maybe they have 0. Whatever the case may be, we're going to be answering the questions in this episode. Guys, let me know in the comment section, how many classics do each of these rappers have? And if this is your first time watching NFR Podcast, hit the subscribe button below. Let's get into this. First rapper for today is Travis Scott. You and I have had these discussions in live streams. We've talked about it on our own personal time. We've talked about it with friends and producers in the community. And I feel like we're going to have maybe the same answer for today. So when you went through the catalog, how many did you count?
I think Rodeo is the obvious one. I mean,
that's a lock.
That's an absolute lock. Astro World's a classic as well. I mean, it defined the mainstream hip-hop decade for the 2010s. It elevated the psychedelic trap sound from Rodeo. That's another one.
Classic features on that record as well with Don Toliver, Sheck West, Stop Trying to Be God. You have a classic record in Sicko Mode as well.
But I think he has 3 classics, and I think the third one isn't Utopia, but it's Days Before Rodeo.
No, you can't give it to DBR.
I'm giving it to DBR before because we've seen the legacy of this project play out. We saw that with a 10-year anniversary release to DSPs, how much in demand that project was. We also know that this is a project that helped shape the modern sound of trap music. It kind of was like the groundwork for Rodeo. You have iconic songs like Drugs You Should Try It, Quintana Part 2, Don't Play. To me, this is more of like a clear as day classic than Utopia is all day.
We gave Utopia the stamp of being a top 10 album of the decade so far.
Yes.
It is a top 3 album of 2023, so it has the quality factor for it. You have classic records off of that album. You have classic moments attached within the community to that album. It saved mainstream hip-hop in 2023 and was one of the biggest events of the 2020s decade so far. It has a cult following behind it. It has the same excitement that something like an Astro World or a Rodeo had when it did drop. So therefore, I'm giving that a classic fucking stamp. There's no way.
2 years, bro. What happened to the 5-year rule?
Well, listen, I think it's going to age as a classic.
Okay, so it's not a classic
I
yet.
think it's going to age as a classic. Fine, if you want to give it 3, because I think DBR is a classic mixtape.
Yes,
I think
that's
you
a
could say
classic
that.
tape. Yes.
I think it's a staple in the mixtape game, especially when it came out. Like it's not necessarily the blog era. I mean, it's a bit past that. But regardless, though, like your arguments are totally fair, and you see the demand for that mixtape all these years later.
Yeah.
The cult following behind it. I don't think there's a single person that dislikes that mixtape as well. Classic moments attached to it, like you said. It laid down the groundwork not only for I think Travis's catalog and the way that he would develop it, but also the way that like psychedelic hip hop and the way that psychedelic trap music would be further developed over the years with records like Drugs You Should Try It, songs like Skyfall. All-time great collaborations off that mixtape. And so, I agree with you. I think 3 to 4 is a fair range.
Yeah, I think for Utopia, time will tell. I think it has the possibility of going down as a classic. Obviously, like you said, it was super important for the year that it came out. That being said, I just don't feel like it was as innovative as a Rodeo or Astro World. I feel like it wasn't as strong in terms of like just
There's
overall
no album
track
this decade
list.
that sounds like that album.
There isn't, but there's an album from the previous decade that does, and it's Jesus.
No, but regardless, though, there's so many different albums that borrow sounds from previous records before.
I know.
Carti wasn't the first one to do Chipmunk Soul.
But I'm just saying, with Rodeo and Astro World, those albums sounded completely fresh. The soundscape sounded brand new. With Yeezus, it was clear that like there was a lot of homage going on. Even looking at Telekinesis, that was clearly a song that was pulled from the Donda era.
But that doesn't take away from the classic factor.
It doesn't take away from the classic factor. I'm just saying, when I'm looking at what could make it go down as a classic, it's going to come down to the impact years down the line, and we're not there yet.
I just look at the check marks, right? Top 10 album of the decade, one of the biggest commercial
for now,
releases
by the
of
way,
decade.
halfway through. But
whatever. We still had incredibly stacked years. Probably the best trap album that's come out this decade. Classic records on it. Classic performances. Some of the most rap-centric and most heavy rapping performances from Travis within his catalog. If it wasn't for that album in 2023, I don't know where the industry would be. That completely revitalized everything. It was dead. It was fucking
hip hop would have survived.
It would have survived, but it was winter dead for the mainstream.
I know.
There was
I know.
no quality releases. There's not another album this decade that's done that, by the way. Anyway, so listen, I think
we both have 3.
To be safe, it's 3. I think Utopia will age as a classic. You're
Okay.
right. Let's play the 5-year rule. Let's wait to see. But let's go on to J. Cole. A lot of people have debates about J. Cole's catalog and say that he does not have a classic. I could tell you this. You're fucking wrong. There's no way. There's no way.
How are you going to look at
No way.
2014 Forest Hills Drive, and try to argue that it's not a classic album. He literally just sold out Madison Square Garden 10 years after the album came out and performed just that album. The album is 6 times platinum with no features whatsoever. You have some of the best hip-hop songs of the last fucking 10, 20 years with Love Yours, A Tale of Two Cities, GOMD, etc. There's no way in hell this album is not a classic. Like, there's a lot of people that say, like you said, that he doesn't have at least one. This one, to me, is the most undeniable. Like, there's no way you can make a claim
when you
against
think of the 2010s for hip hop, right? Even if you want to go like name me a couple of albums that you think of when you think about the 2010s decade for hip hop. You think of GKMC, you think of MBDTF, you think of Nothing Was the Same, you think of Rodeo, you think of 2014 Forest Hills Drive
Right
for
away.
sure. And it was his year. Like, he dominated his year with that, even if it came out in the month of December. I think that's a lock. I don't think Role Models is I think close to 2 times Diamond up to this point, right? And there's no features on that. Not only that, I know it doesn't add anything for the classic conversation, but most of the album is low-key self-produced. I find that to be even crazier. But that's a lock. I think the other lock you could go with is Friday Night Lights. And I think a lot of people would agree with us just because if you were within that blog era of listening to albums, or should I say mixtapes, and you were using DatPiff, you were using Spinnerella, you were going, to different torrent sites or whatever it is, you're going to MySpace pages. MySpace wasn't as prominent in 2009, just to say, but you get the point. Friday Night Lights was somewhat in rotation.
Yeah.
The quality of the record speaks for itself. You could argue that it's one of the very few mixtapes that has that album quality to it. It was supposed to be a debut studio album for Cole's catalog. I think that it's one of the strongest albums within his catalog, and it's a top 5 mixtape of all time.
Absolutely.
And it has classic records on it.
Okay, so we're on board. We got Friday Night Lights. We got 2014 Forest Hills Drive. Now let's talk about For Your Eyes Only, which
I
is
consider a classic.
an album that I absolutely love. I think that it's one of the strongest concept records that I've listened to in the last 10 years, without a doubt. The narrative, the way that it's so tightly constructed from beginning to end, insane. That being said, there's always been, to me, a divide on this album when it comes to like the general public, and that's why I don't think it's seen as a
But what
classic.
is the divide though? Like what do you think it is?
What I think it is when it comes down to the divide with this album, it comes down to 2 different things. The first one, the reason why I see some people not gravitate towards it is the lack of replay value, which that's kind of subjective. It is a bit slower and kind of down tempo, whatever. The other reason that I see that maybe there's a bit more validity to this one is that when you look at when this album came out, it came out in 2016. It wasn't too long after To Pimp a Butterfly, and these 2 albums often get compared because they share a lot of similar themes, just that Kendrick tackled those themes with more nuance, with more depth, and I think that the reason why it doesn't have the same impact is because the groundbreaking factor of TPAB overshadowed For Your Eyes Only for a lot of people. I'm able to enjoy both albums for their own merit, but I think the reason...
Where'd you see this take?
I've seen it so all over the place. People I've spoken to, I've seen journalists, YouTubers. Like, this is a very popular opinion that the album
they made concept records back to back in different years.
Sorry?
Like what do you mean that they overlap? Those albums cannot sound...
No, I said that
so
TPAB overshadowed it in the moment because it came out in a quick, similar span of time.
It was a year and a half.
But I do agree that like the impact of To Pimp a Butterfly is way greater than For Your Eyes Only.
Butterfly like conversation. Sold 500,000 copies first week. Incredible concept records, classic records for Cole's catalog. If we're getting it to Friday Night Lights, we're giving it to For Your Eyes Only.
I don't give it. I don't give it to For Your Eyes Only.
One of his biggest ever tours was attached to this. It was one of the most popular albums of 2016 when it was released. I think it's just people don't like to admit that it's a classic for some weird reason.
To me, like, this is not even about how great I think the album is. It's really like, guys, this is not an album about like how many masterpieces do we think these artists have. When it comes to a classic, there needs to be that general consensus, and from what I've seen, it's just not there for Your Eyes Only. For whatever reasons you want to give it, I don't see it there. What I'm trying to say is that, like,
tangible thing.
When I ask you right away, Doggy Style, yeah, classic. Like, you can ask anyone in the world, they're giving it the classic stamp. Same with Get Rich or Die Trying. Same with 36 Chambers, etc.
So you think if I ask anyone if Friday Night Lights is a classic, the entire world will tell you yes?
Yes,
I guarantee
I
there's
think
more
so.
people that have listened to For Your Eyes Only. and that would give it.
But those that have followed Cole's journey and that are aware of the mixtape would be more keen to say yes to that project than they would to For Your Eyes Only, in my opinion. From what I've seen. From what I've seen.
I haven't seen that. I think you ask any Cole fan or anyone that's followed his journey, they would say that that's one of the best albums in his catalog, even though that's not what you're arguing. I'm just saying that people attach that to a classic moment when he dropped one of his best and most popular albums. It has the statistics, it has the longevity to be able to speak to the quality and impact of that record.
Like, I think Born Sinner is even closer to being a classic album than For Your Eyes Only.
Get the fuck out of here.
I'm not in terms of classic records, an album that is beloved by everybody. I think it even comes a bit closer. It's not a better album, but I think it comes closer.
Well, I will say this: the only reason why I think you can make it as well, make that argument. Whenever I go to Cole sets, he barely performs that album.
That's true.
Doesn't perform Immortal. Doesn't perform.
I never thought about that.
Performs Change. I've seen him perform Change a couple of times. Yeah, he did it. He did it at what was it? It's All a Blur tour.
Okay.
Remember he did that? Or did he do it? Anyways, regardless.
You're right, though. He doesn't really perform it.
He doesn't really perform it. So I guess you can make that argument regardless, though. A concept album selling over 500,000 copies, still having the longevity that it did, having the groundbreaking records that it did on top of it, I think it's a classic.
So you have here 3, I have 2, which means that I'm saying that Travis is more classics than Cole. That sounds crazy, but that's just where we're at. But all right, next up we have Eminem. I think we can easily lock the Slim Shady, the Marshall Mathers LP, and the Eminem Show.
And I think it ends there.
Wow. I didn't expect you to say that, but yes.
I think it ends there.
Yes. That's the right answer.
I mean, Recovery is not a classic. It had great records on it. It's a good pop rap record. I mean, maybe it has classic moments attached to it, like Not Afraid and Love the Way You Lie, but does that really make like a classic album?
No, and Relapse, you could argue, has become a cult classic over time, but it's gotten way too much hate and has had too much of a polarizing stamp on it.
Yeah, but there's certain artists here that have polarizing albums within their catalog.
That do have classics.
That
within
you do say it's a classic, right? So
True.
I don't really look at that. I'm just saying I think that it's undeniable that you look at M's catalog and you say the big three. You can make arguments also, I guess, only for those 3. I'm being honest.
But I will say this, back to the whole like polarizing and like a divide on an album. I do want to say that like sometimes the influence of an album and like how much it's affected the landscape of hip hop, that could trump the actual public opinion and agreement or disagreement on if it's a classic or not.
But I think that Eminem has those records.
Which Relapse doesn't have and For Your Eyes Only doesn't have, but another album we're going to get to for another artist does have.
Oh, for sure. We know where to go with this one. But okay, let's keep going on with this. Let's go on to JID. JID has developed quite the catalog up to this point. Very patient with his album releases. Decided to release The Never Story. And of course, he had mixtapes like Para 2 that came out before this. I don't think anything before The Never Story could even be considered in this conversation.
All flew under the radar. All of them.
Flew under the radar. The Never Story was his big coming out party. Then after that, you get DC2 that was followed up with Revenge of the Dreamers 3, which is a huge performance and breakout for him. And then after that, obviously The Forever Story.
So only 3 albums. Very young discography.
I think he has one that could be considered, and it's The Forever Story.
I think The Forever Story has a strong chance of going down as a classic album. I think that people have marveled at just the sheer lyrical ability. And like Jid right now is at a place where he's a top 5 rapper. He is like, when you think about hip hop and like the fate of hip hop and the survival of the genre, like he's one of the guys that you think to in terms of like who's gonna really carry the mantle as the years go on.
I look at The Forever Story as like maybe not this commercial juggernaut, right? But let's say I ask you about like, you know, Black on Both Sides by Mos Def
or a Black Star, right?
Exactly.
Those are classic albums, even though they didn't have the mass appeal.
But even let's say something like a Beat by Common, for example, like it's not necessarily the most marketable album in the world. Obviously, it did super well, and there's crazy marketable records and sneaky ones off of this album. I just think that it strives in different areas, right? Because you could talk about surround sound. You know, there's a bunch of different songs on here that got a lot of good mainstream play, but I think it's what it meant for the genre at the time and how, like you said, it gives you hope for the next generation to come and carry that art of lyricism. So for now, I say none, but I think by the time we reach, like, you know, the end of the decade. Even now, I could give it to him. But we'll see how
Yeah,
it goes.
I think the Forever Story is gonna go down as a classic. But next up, we have 21 Savage.
This one's interesting.
This is interesting because obviously, like, his big launch into the hip hop mainstream was Savage Mode, and you get some of his most iconic songs on there, like X and No Heart. Then you get the sequel, which was a bigger splash. That was probably still is his most beloved album amongst the entire fan
I
base.
Am Greater Than I Was that you're talking about?
I'm talking about Savage Mode 2.
Oh, the second installment.
I think that's the album that maybe has the closest chance to being deemed a classic.
Without Warning is a classic. He has one.
Without Warning is a classic.
It's
yeah.
his album
If you want,
as well.
I don't count that, I guess, because it's a collab album. But if you want to count it, sure.
His name's attached to it.
Yeah, you can count that.
I would count it as one. He has a classic. His name is attached to one classic album.
Yeah, I think when you look at just the collab albums in the modern age, that's one that everyone points to as being fantastic from
the
start
replay
to
volume is
finish.
insane on that. Classic records like Ric Flair drip anthems. I mean, all-time performances by both Offset and 21 Savage. I don't. It's arguably Metro Boomin's best ever album that he's contributed to.
Yeah, I would probably say so. Yeah.
I think
it
that's.
is.
I think that's. And I think
It is.
people. It's also the moment that it was attached to, right? You always have to make that argument. Like, why is it classic? Why did it feel so important in that moment? Like, when that Halloween date came around in 2017, and that album dropped, like, it was in rotation everywhere. There was multiple songs. It appealed to the general hip hop masses as well. I think a lot of people that appreciate conscious rap and that appreciate, like, even boom bap or jazz rap, like, they fell in love with this album as well because of the cinematic value and the intent with it, right? It was focused, it was coherent, it was no bullshit. They came and they played on a different level when it came to their performances. And not only that, but, like, could you argue that this is better than Culture? You can make the argument. Do I think it's better than Culture? That's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
But to be able to even play on that level in 2017, to me, that one of the biggest moments to close off a massive commercial year for that year, and to even have replay value going into 2018 with how many big records came in that year, it's absolutely ridiculous.
It's also like defined a holiday for the genre. When you think about like a Halloween hip hop album,
For sure.
it's Without Warning every day. So 21 Savage personal catalog 0. If we're including Without Warning, I give it the 1.
I give it to Without Warning, but let's keep going on with this Jay-Z extensive catalog. Started his career in 1996 with Reasonable Doubt. Obviously was dropping things before that, but this was his debut album and was the biggest album for him at the time in the 90s. And I have to say this, in the 90s, I feel like there's one undeniable classic, and it's that.
Reasonable Doubt.
Yeah. I don't know if I give it to any of the volumes.
That's the big question mark. I feel like that's where there's going to be the most debate when it comes to how many classics.
If you want to
who
debate
has,
with me, it's
because-
volume 1, and that's where I end it.
Well, I mean, listen, there's some of my favorite ever Jay-Z songs in Volume 1, like Imaginary Players, Where I'm From. Like, there's classic records on that, but it suffers from the same problems that Volume 2 suffers from. And I think that maybe more people would make the argument for Volume 2 just because I'm pretty sure it's his most commercially successful album, bro. It was his first #1 album. You were doing a TikTok the other day where you said that it sold 2 million physical copies. That is
Yeah.
fucking insane,
So
bro.
2 million physicals.
That
yeah,
is
it's the peak of his popularity,
insane.
but regardless, though.
But you know what it is? There's too much mid on that
Okay, but
track
you know what?
list.
Yeah, but let's say you talk to someone like Coleman, for example, right? And you talk to him about Jay's catalog. Someone that's from New York, someone that loves New York hip hop's been following the scene for longer than we've been alive, right? I don't think he gives Volume 2 that stamp of classic.
Probably not, because he knows
doesn't-
the record's not strong
Yeah, but I
enough.
don't think he gives any of those volume runs, any
No,
classic records.
and as they shouldn't get it.
I
in
think
my
the only
opinion.
one you could give it to is honestly Volume 1, but Reasonable Doubt, that's the only one from the 90s that I'm giving it to. I give it to The Blueprint. I
Yes.
give it to The Black Album.
Yes.
I give it to 444, and I give it to Watch the Throne, including collaboration albums. 4 classics as far as solo albums go, and then after that collaborations, I'm including Watch the Throne.
I think 444 is the one that people might be the most on the fence with, but
It was a
I
classic
agree.
moment,
I think it was a classic moment, and I think just what it meant for the evolution of Jay-Z as well, getting that personal, getting that vulnerable.
Well, not only that, but it sparked a competitive nature within hip hop again. The
It did.
headlines. I remember I was watching Everyday Struggle when Nadeska Jones, Joe Budd, and Academics were still doing the show, And, you know, I think you had Joe Budden going through the lyrics and people were debating, right? Like, was he going at Future? Was he going at Drake here? Talking about Kanye. Like, it was one of those albums that got, like, the fine comb treatment where everyone wanted to see what he had to say. I feel like people paid attention to that album, right? The story of OJ, like, that caused a lot of conversation in the community because people were trying to, you know, go through the lyrics and trying to sort of decipher what's he saying here. Like, it had that hip hop nerd effect to it. You know, and I think that's why the core community values it so much. Not only that, but, you know, it's the first time you ever see Jay-Z and No ID do a whole album together. That as well.
Yeah, of
and
course.
Like seeing him
And
executive produce the entire project is
I also think that when you look at like Jay-Z's legacy overall, when he does retire, maybe he already has, who knows, but you're going to always be able to, you know, attach this to not Jay-Z the rapper, but Jay-Z the mogul. Like this is where you really got the mogul talk, the talk on generational wealth, on investments. Like this just created its own subgenre almost and did it in the right way. So yeah, I think it will go down as a classic if it isn't already. So 4 classics for Jay-Z, the most we've given today.
The most we've given
To any other rapper.
Yeah, but that's not
expected.
That's not bad. Yeah.
That's expected.
All right, let's go on to the next one. Playboi Carti. So I'm kind of doing some foreshadowing at the beginning of this episode with a certain album that obviously like we're not haters of, but ones that we think get like slightly a bit over. I would say overrated. That's the best word I could possibly use, right? I think it's a really solid album with Whole Lotta Red. I think there's great records off of that album. But at the same time, regardless about how I feel about the album, my personal rotation, it's an undeniable classic.
Yeah, already.
Changed
so
the landscape,
quickly it became one.
Changed the landscape of music forever. You also see it within the demand of his music. I feel like Carti took on this new dimension and this new lore to his brand where people were not necessarily treating him like the Cash Carti. You know, they weren't treating him like that era. You know, they didn't see him like that anymore. They saw him as a tastemaker. They saw him as a leader for the new generation. They saw him as a pioneer that was releasing records that were being played in these festivals and these crowds, and kids were fucking smashing their heads through walls, and now everyone had to adapt to that sound. Trippie Redd couldn't like sit on his ass anymore. Uzi had to have, you know, certain records sound a certain way to make it
young boy is gonna make a whole lot of Red influenced album.
Like, you know, everyone was trying to attack this sound, and you know what? No one did it properly except for him, and obviously the Sofagos. Obviously, you have people like the Destroy Lonelys and the Ken Carsons that have done it well and built careers off of it. But for the guys that were already coming up in that class that tried to compete with him, no one was able to make the transition with him.
Yeah, he's literally shaped the sound of modern hip hop, or at least partially did with that album, and I think that he deserves his flowers for that. And what's crazy is that with the strength of that album and everything that it caused, he's now able 5 years later to perform major festivals and headline at major festivals with those records, and because of the punk energy that he brought to that whole era and that whole movement, that speaks fucking volumes to the impact of that album.
And you know what? It was also a sound that was never really attacked before.
Yeah.
Right? Like listening to the Art Dealer production and like
those chiptune synths
and the filthy production. I get it. I think there's people that have incorporated rock samples and have done live instrumentation within their hip hop records
it's
before.
Just the juxtaposition of it all.
Exactly. And it's also like what type of rock and what type of like punk rock he was attacking and bringing that to the forefront. Not only that, but it's not like you were saying like it's a cheap imitation. He was just sampling it. He threw it on the album because he had to switch up. No, like it got a lot of people excited, and I think that it was also an album that showed his range as an artist as far as like what he could choose to attack. You know, and I think that this new run of Carti, right, where he's using the deeper voices, you know, you're hearing all the features. This is before I Am Music. He knew that he was going to have to switch it up because you'll never replicate that. Anyone that's smart enough to hear that album knows like you'll never replicate that. And it's probably the best album as far as like innovation goes within his catalog.
For sure. I prefer Dial Lit and Self-Titled, but Whole Lotta Red's the classic. Carti gets one here. Next up, Lil Baby. I think the only album that stands a chance for Lil Baby is My Turn, and I still don't think it's a classic record. I do think, obviously, It's one of the most successful albums of the 2020s decade. There's no denying that. But I don't think it's strong enough as an album. It feels more like a compilation, like a playlist. It doesn't feel like a timeless album. I feel like the anthems like Whoa and Some to Prove will be remembered on their own and not part as the greater whole of My Turn, if that makes sense.
Do you think it's crazy that like you can make this that My Turn isn't a classic? Like I think
it feels like a classic to you?
I think it feels like a
don't
classic.
think so.
I think it was a classic for the pandemic. I think it was a classic for 2020. It's a classic trap record.
You ask 100 hip hop fans, not 50 of them are telling you it's a classic.
Oh, I don't know, Lou. I think people will.
No.
I think it gets loved by the publications as well. Fuck it. I'll throw in that. I'll give it that.
No, not a classic, bro. No
It
way.
has-
An album still has to have like its strength. Like I'm not saying it's a good album. It's a really good album, but it's not. It doesn't have that timeless factor. And like I said,
Still getting streamed heavy, Lou.
I just feel like a classic album also has to like stand out for its own identity. I don't feel like My
Yeah.
Turn has like.
Oh, I don't know. It sounds. It's.
I don't know.
I get
man.
what you're saying though. I'm gonna give it
I
to
don't
him
know.
though.
I'm not gonna give it. Okay.
I give it to him. I
So
think
you
My
give him
Turn's a-
one?
I give him one. I think My Turn's a classic, and I think that's the only one that you could possibly say is.
All right.
Let's keep going on with this Pop Smoke. The biggest like what if story in hip hop history for me, especially with how quick he blew up in 2019. It was like welcome to the party and boom on right away. Pioneering the drill scene, brought it to new heights. Obviously, you could say Chicago drill was super prominent and UK drill was going off, and you had people like Chief Keef, Bobby Shmurda was attacking it somewhat in New York, in 2014, but it wasn't truly drill. But I think with this, it was a whole new sound, and I think that you're seeing Pop Smoke's production styles and the way that he's attacking his flows being replicated by a lot of people nowadays.
Brooklyn drill is not in a good place though, and I think that it would have been in a very different place if Pop Smoke was still around.
Oh, for sure. The records that he was releasing were great, right? But for classics, let's have the classic conversation. I don't give it to any of the Meet the Woos.
I don't think he has a classic album.
I think Shoot
that,
for the Stars, Aim for the Moon's a classic moment. Do I think it's a classic record?
No.
You can make the argument, but I don't think it has a
so.
classic either.
I think he has classic songs. I think Dior's without a doubt a classic song. Welcome to the Party, Christopher Walken. You can make the arguments for Invincible, what you know about love, etc. But I don't think he has a classic album. But I do feel like the legacy is undeniable, and his influence on the drill scene, like we were saying, it's immeasurable. Like we're gonna hear it ring off for a long time. But all right, last one today is gonna be MF Doom, and with MF Doom, obviously, none of his albums ever really had commercial success, but he is the king of the underground and hip hop. And when
he's
you look
charted
at,
before though, he's charted like somewhat.
I
He's
know,
had
but
a bit of charting.
I know all that to say, he is your favorite rapper's favorite rapper, one of the best lyricists to ever do it. That's something that we all know. If you're a hip hop head and you've listened to MF Doom, you know that his discography does have classic albums. We saw what the excitement was like for the Food anniversary, the 20-year anniversary. They got a
That's a
re-release.
classic.
That's a classic album. Mad Villainy
Classic record.
is another classic album. You could then there's two. There's two that are like maybes. It's Operation Doomsday, and then there's Vaudeville Villain.
I don't give it to Vaudeville Villain.
What an amazing album!
It's an amazing album, but
Yeah,
we didn't give it to For Your Eyes
it's-
Only.
yeah, that's what it is.
You got to give it the same treatment. I'm
It's a
sorry.
masterpiece to me. Like some of the most creative production.
If you told
but
me Operations Doomsday, like I'd say okay. It's probably his most accessible album, and it's probably the one that's getting maybe the most streams at this point in time.
probably, yeah.
If I had to look at the daily streams, I don't think it would show up on
I would probably
Chartmasters.
give it to Operation Doomsday because it was the introduction to MF Doom, and there are some of his most popular songs off of that album. And
I think a lot of hip hop heads too, like would probably call it a classic.
I think so.
Yeah, I think solid 3 classics: Mad Villainy, Operations, and then after that, Food.
Yeah, that's
Those
what it
are
would
3,
be.
and they're solidified.
So
I don't think it's ever in question for Food and then Mad Villainy.
yeah,
And especially with those albums, everyone wants those vinyls in their studio.
100%.
Everyone
That's
wants,
what it is,
like,
like-
it's like the representation, right? It's the taste making factor of those albums. Like it's like you said, your favorite rapper's favorite rapper type of thing.
Yeah.
You have to pay respects, and you know what it did for hip hop and just the quality of those records. Fuck it, like don't even say that they're amazing records. Like there's like cult fan bases. Some of the biggest cult fan bases in hip hop are following those projects.
100%.
I
But
give
yeah,
him 3.
so 3 albums that are classics for MF Doom. Out of everyone that we spoke about today, Jay-Z had the most with 4.
Jay-Z had the most.
Makes sense.
It
That's
does
kind
make
of
sense.
what I predicted.
I think we were pretty on par with everything.
We agreed on mostly everything except for a couple.
I think the Baby take is reasonable from you. I won't argue that. I mean, I understand why. I just think you can make a strong argument for why it is.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest records of the 2020s. It has the quality behind it. It came out at an important time for hip hop. Again, I like that though. Like that album in Utopia kind of shared that sentiment where they were major albums at a time where like the industry was struggling, and they did a lot of carrying, and they made a lot of people happy at times where the industry was kind of like a fucking desert.
Yeah, it's true.
With that being said, guys, let us know, where did we get it right, where did we get it wrong, and who else should we bring into the next installment of Do These Rappers Have a Classic? Thank you guys so much for watching this episode, and we'll catch you in the next one. Peace.